How many people know how to call a button in Hebrew? This was a question that's actually related, strangely enough, to this weekly reading, this week's Parsha, Truma. And before I get to it, let me ask a more general question in any language, English, Russian. There are all kinds of new words that are constantly introduced. And there are a few different methods that are used to introduce them. There's a famous joke that the American and the British person are arguing whether the correct name for the elevator is lift. And the American says, well, we're the ones who invented the elevator. And the British person says, and we're the ones who invented the English language. The point is that it's actually a very complex system that's used. Part of it comes from the people themselves sometimes, and part of it comes from the linguists that decide and introduce to the people the new words. And every language, of course, doesn't stay in one place, and sometimes there are more meanings introduced to already a known word. For instance, the word button, right? Originally, it was the button on your shirt or on your suit, but later began to also mean the button that you push, the button in the elevator. And of course, a lot of times there are loan words that come from other languages. So what happens specifically with Hebrew? With regards to Hebrew in particular, it's a very interesting phenomenon. On the one hand, we have the entire Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, in the original. Almost all of it is written in Hebrew, with some small portions written in Aramaic language, which is a relative of Hebrew anyway. On the other hand, we have a huge amount of the words of our sages that lived about 2,000 years ago to about 1,500 years ago. That's the main period of the sages that we call Chazal. Chachamenu zichronam libracha. It's an abbreviation. And a lot of the words that they used came from other languages, by the way. By that time, of course, many words came from Aramaic. That was the language they spoke, both in Babylonia, and in the land of Israel. They spoke Syriac, a version of Aramaic. And then, of course, the Greek language had a tremendous influence. And many of the items that people were accustomed to came from Greek, less commonly from Latin, sometimes from Persian, from Farsi, and in many other cases from other languages. Even in case of later sages, and in particular when there were a lot of Jews living in Arab countries, and in particular the works written on medicine, for instance, there were a number of great sages that were accepted by the Arabs also as being great sages. The most famous one was the Maimonides, of whom even the Arab poets wrote poems of his greatness. So, of course, all of them used the terms that were used by the Arabs. So that's why there are always, of course, terms introduced from other languages. But today, of course, in the modern Hebrew, there are linguists. By the way, the word linguist also comes from Tanakh. It's based on the book of Ezra, that the word balshan, linguist. The word linguist itself is a word that's basically based on the Bible. So a lot of times, our linguists today, when they want to introduce, whether it's a new fruit, let's say orange, there were no oranges in the land of Israel 2,000 years ago, certainly not 3,000 years ago in the biblical times. So how would you call an orange? So in the end, the accepted way became tapuach zahav, golden apple. Apple, tapuach, is a biblical word, so golden apple became the orange. Tapuz is the abbreviation. A more complex situation happened to tomatoes. There were a lot of various propositions of how to call a tomato. And of course, before the advent of modern Hebrew, there are already works of the rabbis that used terms for oranges, terms for tomatoes, but many times there was no agreement. So one rabbi would use maybe a local term. Pomeranz in some languages means an orange. Others used a different term. And even something like coffee, almost all the halachic books that talk about coffee, they write some word that's similar to coffee, but it's spelled differently. There are maybe 10 spellings of kave, coffee, all kinds of ways. And the modern Hebrew tried to kind of standardize it. And there is one way to spell coffee and one way to call orange. So with tomatoes, there were a number of prepositions. One, for instance, to take this word from the Arabic. Of course, tomatoes themselves came from America. There were possibilities of actually writing tomato of some sort in Hebrew letters. and there were other possibilities, but in the end they chose a word agvaniyot, because apparently they used to be thought of, and I think in Italian and certain other languages, the word comes from the idea that tomato was supposed to bring, I guess, more desire sexually. Just happens to be, right? They thought it's a kind of aphrodisiac of sorts. So that's why agavim, right, is a physical temptation, desire, something like that. So this is a biblical word. So they used that root to describe the tomatoes. But coming back to our buttons, of course, buttons existed quite a while in our culture, but not always. It's not clear what time the Jews actually had the first buttons. If you look on Wikipedia, they say, I think that in India they had buttons. I mean, there were two types of buttons, first of all, in ancient times. One is to actually connect something, and one is to just for decorative purposes. And like I said, the third thing that in English language at least the button started to mean, and in modern Hebrew as well, is something you push, a knob to push to make some device work, or a button in an elevator. In Russian, by the way, it's two different words for those two types of buttons. It's not the same word as the button on a shirt. But at any rate, the word was actually taken from our Parsha, Kaftor. Now, interestingly enough, there are actually other candidates in the close Parshiyot, the next Parsha and the Parsha 4 from now, at the end of Sefer Shemot, the words that could have actually maybe even meant a button in the ancient times. But for some reason, the choice fell on a word that in the Torah does not mean a button, but it's maybe shaped somewhat like a button. Even that is not so clear. It has to do with the way the Menorah in the temple looked. It was all one piece of gold, but it had in its branches and in its stem, it had the kinds of forms, like maybe flowery and with balls of sorts. And one of the things mentioned there is Kaftor. Some kind of a shape to be closest to the shape of a button, and that's why Kaftor became the word for a button. And later on, when this became also a button for the devices, the same word is used in modern Hebrew, just like in English. It became the button that you push. But there are two other words, and interestingly, as I said, that may be candidates for actual buttons in ancient times. Not something that's just part of a shape of the menorah, but actual buttons. One is mishbetzot. This is going to be in the next week's Parsha, in Parshat Tetzaveh. The Choshen and Eifod, parts of the clothing that the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, wore, they were connected through some kind of mishbetzot. And this may have been actually some kind of buttons. Rav Hai Kaplan brings it in the name of Yosef Flavi, Josephus Flavius. There was this Josephus, as the Yunajus usually call him. There was this sage who mostly wrote in Greek for the Greek audience, for the Greek and Roman audience. Romans usually knew Greek language as well, even though their main language was Latin, of course. But they mostly spoke, at least the aristocracy there spoke classical Greek. So Josephus wrote quite a bit about our people, our ancient history, and somewhat of a commentary on the Torah. And Rav Hai Kaplan keeps quoting him on various issues. And he, of course, was a witness of how the clothing of the high priest looked in the Second Temple, at the end of the Second Temple. He actually lived through all this. He saw it with his own eyes. So he described some kind of buttons. By the way, interestingly, when zipper was translated into modern Hebrew, you know what word they used? Also nearby. The previous word was in 20th chapter, 13th verse. This is 20th chapter, 28th verse. That it says, right? And by the way, the same word is used even to close the button in Hebrew, to actually button the shirt. The verb is from the shoresh of reish kaf samech, and that's this verb. V'yirkesu, they closed these buttons. And as I said, the zipper in modern Hebrew is rokhsan, based on this shoresh. Another word that might have been maybe meant a decorative button is at the end of the description of the Kohen's garments in Parshat Pekudei, at the end of Sefer Shemot. This is 39th chapter, 20th verse. It says paarei. And paarei, there are a lot of different translations of this word. But Chizkuni writes in the name of Rav Hai Gaon that this was some kind of Kaftorim. And Rabbi Kaplan, based on that, thinks that it means some kind of decorative buttons. However, it's also possible that Chizkuni did not use the word Kaftor in the sense that we use it today, of course, the button shape, as I mentioned, more like a cup shape, and maybe what he meant is something else. At any rate, the top of the head covering of the priest was something called paarei, which may have meant some kind of decorative buttons. And on this I'm going to end for today. And if you like this video, please press like and please subscribe to our channel.